And so, good evening, everyone. I'm Pallavi Ade, and I am your co-host along with Shrez. So, we are the co-founders of Asian Pathfinders. Welcome to another edition of our dialogues and our discussions. So, we've been having them for a very long time now. But yeah, great to have people. We just talking that we have people from various continents joining in on a discussion of technology. So, uh, great to see everyone. And today's topic is adaptability of artificial intelligence, security, and challenges. So before I hand it over to our moderator, I just go over a few housekeeping rules. So about Asian Pathfinders, we were started to have this forum where we can get people from various fields, right? Scholars, practitioners, academics, to have these discussions on a variety of topics. So when I say a variety, we really do have. So last week we had something on radical and liberal age, or this week we have artificial intelligence today. And on Saturday, we have our fireside chats, which is on what's happening in the Black and the Caspian Seas region. So that's just over the last 8 days, and we have more discussions, those kinds coming up. And we want to be an informal forum, so we do welcome everyone to reach out to us, give us your suggestions, feedback, as well as any ideas that you have. Uh, in terms of the guidelines, I know Shreyas will put it in the chat section, but just this is an open forum, so we really ask you to express yourself, put in your comments and questions, but just respect the views of others. And respect the intellectual property. I think the language and the intellectual property aspect we always emphasize on. So the upcoming sessions, like I said, we have one this Saturday. Shreyas will provide you the link, and post that we have one on information warfare and the Indian foreign policy. I think a lot of the discussions around Indian foreign policies in the last decades has been India's relation with its neighbors, but we don't look at the whole information warfare and how it plays a part. So we have a great speaker for that too, Suhasini Heather. So the ones who don't know, she is the diplomatic affairs editor for a leading Indian newspaper. And this Saturday, we have Richard Girogosin speaking on the developments, not just in the Nagorno-Karabakh, but the wider region of the Caucasus and the Black and the Caspian Sea. So that's me and Shreyas, and you can find us on social medias, different Facebook, Twitters, everywhere. So before I hand it to Charumati Haran, who is our moderator for this session, and she will introduce the speakers. Uh, just to tell you about Charumati, Charumati is currently a student of Master of Public Policy at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany. Prior to that, she has worked with the National Skill Development Council, which is a public-private partnership in the government of India. She holds some undergraduate of economics from Delhi University. And one of the reasons why we asked Charumati to come and moderate today was because a lot of her interest is driven on how these technologies affect public policies in our world that we live in, not just today, but in the future. So before I keep speaking and you get bored of me, I'm going to hand it over to Charu to introduce the speakers and take on the proceedings. So over to you, Charu.
Thank you, Pallavi. It's a real pleasure to be here today with such an expert panel that we have present. We have representation from the industry, from research bodies, and also from the private sector, I think, in a sense, which would be a pretty fun place to be. And very, very suited to the topic that we have, considering how interconnected AI is in terms of application, definition, inputs, and outputs. I did have a bit of an opening statement prepared, but I'm worried that I'll end up with more questions than with answers. So I will just emphasize two things before proceeding. One, McKinsey argues that by 2030, AI will take over 70% of industries. B, a lot of debates are driven by the black box nature of AI. So I'm very much hoping our panelists will help clear it up a little bit for us today. We'll start from some of the grand strategy questions, which is why I would invite Husanjot to speak first. Husanjot will be speaking to us on the military dimensions, strategic side, which often drives the smaller questions that turn up in public policy. She's a research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she focuses on AI competitiveness and military applications of emerging technologies. Before this, she worked in World Bank's Corporate Security Division and in a New Delhi-based research organizations which looked at security issues in South Asia. She's had a graduate degree in security studies from Georgetown and has a master's in international security and terrorism from the University of Nottingham. And I see that she's also an alumni of University of Delhi like me, but in political science from Lady Sri Ram College. So Husanjot, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Charu, for this kind introduction and for coordinating everything. I'll just quickly share my screen with you guys. And Charu, if you could confirm that you seeing the slides and everything looks good.
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, so like many thanks to I'd say the Asian Pathfinders team for organizing this and for bringing us together. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for listening to me. My name is Husan, and I'm a research analyst at Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology. CSET is a data-driven research organization focused on delivering non-partisan analysis on security impacts of emerging technologies. And for the first few years, CSET's research focuses primarily on artificial intelligence. Now, in my talk today, I will be looking at military applications of AI in the context of the investments that are being made by the United States Department of Defense in AI R&D. The US is widely regarded as one of the leaders in artificial intelligence research, as we know, and the emphasis on AI laid by its national security leaders, especially when coupled with its massive defense budget, makes it a prominent voice in the military AI domain, as well as a driver of what will follow in the technology realm in the years to come. A lot of the findings I will discuss today are drawn from our most recent research effort at CSET that spanned almost an year and culminated into 3 reports examining US military investments in AI. Now, all of what I discussed today is the result of tireless work done by my colleagues led by Margarita Konaev, Brian Fedashik, Tina Huang, and Ilya Rahakovsky. The views presented today don't have any liability on CSET, and any errors in my presentation today are just my own. Okay, so to begin with, I'll lay out the analytical framework that guided this research and was developed by my colleague Margarita Konaev at CSET. It focuses on 3 interrelated elements. The first one really answers this question of what is happening in autonomy and AI. And this is the element of technology. And for this, we map the landscape of different R&D programs that were related to AI. The second is a focus on the question of why is the US military spending these resources in order to advance this technological development. And that really relates to military capabilities that are promised to be enabled by breakthroughs in autonomy and AI, with a specific focus on speed, precision, coordination, persistence, reach, lethality, and military endurance. And last is the so what, which is related to the strategic effects of these developments. All of the technological advancements and the capabilities they enhance are exciting, but how do all of these really deter adversaries or enable conducting military operations and working with allies effectively? I will be discussing the findings from the first of these 3 reports today, specifically the report on budgetary assessments, but I encourage you to read the other 2 reports available on CSET's website to get a holistic view of the topic. So when we started working on this topic, we realized that despite all the hype, excitement, and even some fear of futuristic technologies, we actually don't really have a sense of what is it exactly that the US military is doing in artificial intelligence, and what is the scope of its defense investments tailored to AI. A lot of those questions still don't have definitive answers. For example, if you ask me right now how much the US military is spending on AI research, I can't tell you. And I'll just say that it really depends. That answer is a complicated story, and that rests more on how R&D spending is sliced in the first place. To explain this better, I'll briefly touch upon our methodology and the process we undertook for examining the data. Our analysis basically rests on the 2020 budget justification books released by the US Army, Navy, Air Force, and DARPA, focusing specifically on the basic applied and advanced research, all of which supports the development of new technologies imperative for the DoD. So we ran a series of keywords through the descriptions of various research projects listed in these books and identified one set of programs that are related to autonomy and another set related to artificial intelligence. And just to clarify, when we say autonomy, it basically means projects geared towards unmanned systems, for example, UAVs, UGVs, abbreviation, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned ground vehicles. On the other hand, projects under AI include those that can perform tasks by learning from experience, or recognizing patterns and making predictions, etc. The information captured in each of this document is organized in 3 tiers: program elements, or PEs, projects, and what we call as components. Now, PE is the largest unit comprising projects, and each project further consists of components. Now, depending on the tier you're looking at, the figures for the amount of funding given to AI and autonomy research can really vary, as you can see in this chart. A lot of policymakers and national security experts want to know how much the US military invests in emerging technologies, sometimes for a comparison with their Chinese counterparts in this global competition for AI leadership. But our findings illustrate the shortcomings of a singular estimate of US military spending in AI. Now, when it comes to the 2 categories of AI and autonomy, we certainly expected an overlap between these 2 categories, but found it very interesting to see that a majority, and you can say almost 2/3 of AI-related research is also related to autonomy. But the majority of autonomy-related research efforts are not classified as AI. This is to say that a vast majority of US military research efforts, as budgeted for 2018 to 2024, are going to enable greater autonomous functionalities in robotics and physical systems, providing semi-autonomous or autonomous vehicles, drones, etc. And the amount of research directed specifically towards AI and unrelated to autonomy and unmanned systems is relatively small. This raises some concerns, especially when it comes to questions of cyber operations, cyber offense and defense, and vulnerability of critical infrastructure to malicious cyber attacks by adversary countries. The question then remains, is the US investing sufficiently in the right areas, or in some sense, like areas of critical concern for its defense? Now, across all of the identified AI and autonomy projects, we saw that there was a consistent theme running across all technology buckets, which is an emphasis on human-machine teaming. So if you look at the 4 broad functional categories we use to classify autonomy and AI research, we see human-machine teaming emphasized in all of them. For instance, if you look into some of the examples under unmanned vehicles, you have the US Army's next generation combat vehicle research program, which does not look to remove humans completely, contrary to what is imagined for unmanned systems. But the idea is to enable joint human intelligence decision-making. For information processing and decision support, one research program is Army's expeditionary data to decisions technology that enables commanders to make time-critical decisions in tough situations. The emphasis is on presenting the information in alignment with the complex cognitive needs of humans, therefore, once again, not displacing humans, but augmenting their capabilities. For research programs under targeting functions, the emphasis is again on working together with the operator, reducing the workload on the human analyst to improve the robustness of the entire warfighting system. So we see that all of this research is not directed towards replacing humans, but rather research specifically meant to advance intelligent technologies that interact, collaborate, and integrate with soldiers and humans in a way that enhances human capabilities. So while the emphasis on human-machine teaming wasn't very surprising to us as we conducted our research, what did come across as a surprise was the lack of research on trust in human-machine teaming. It is widely known that trust is central to effective human-machine collaboration because it affects the willingness of humans to use intelligent systems and accept the recommendations it provides. Now, when we look for the word trust in all of the identified AI and autonomy projects, we were surprised to learn that only 18 of the 789 components related to autonomy and only 11 of the 287 components related to AI mentioned the word trust. So it became clear that despite the significance of trust in effective human-machine teaming, we are not really studying it. This is likely not limited only to the US military. This gap reflects what is happening with the literature and research outside of the US military as well, where the development of the technology has outpaced the research that is being done on the topic. A lot of what we know today about trust in human-machine collaboration are based on studies that explore systems that were far less sophisticated from what we have today. Much of the research looked into expert systems and automation, and not so much on cutting-edge machine learning approaches, for instance, among others that kind of dominate the AI landscape today. Trust is essential for effective human-machine teaming, especially in the military context. Now, in the short term, these gaps in research could hinder efforts to scale AI for technologies under decision support, for instance. In the long term, they could stall the development and fielding of AI systems in operational environments. Human operators may be reluctant to follow recommendations by an AI system if it does not trust it. On the other hand, if it trusts us way too much, there are risks involved, especially in complex and high-risk situations. Without a contextualized understanding of trust in human-machine teams, the US military may not be able to fully capitalize on the advantages in speed, coordination, and endurance that are promised by autonomy and AI, and it could really undermine its ability to leverage AI for its strategic goals. Now, just to summarize the key points we discussed today, our data-driven research on US military investments in AI and autonomy illustrated the shortcomings of a singular estimate of US military spending in AI. We learned that there is a significant overlap in research on AI and autonomy, with vast majority of US military research efforts tailored towards enabling greater autonomous functions. Across all of AI and autonomous technologies, human-machine teaming runs as a consistent theme. And lastly, despite the significance of trust in effective human-machine teaming, there are very few research efforts studying this topic, which could have serious short and long-term consequences for the US military. And that's all I had for you today. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Husan. That was a really interesting presentation. Because what I found particularly interesting was how a lot of the growth in AI technology in commercial and in civil spaces does draw from what happens in the military. But it may generally operate on a different set of values. You focus on speed, precision, accuracy, and such, whereas a more public conversation might think about reliability, safety, and so on. But there is one common value between them, and that is the one you spoke about, trust. So with that, we can move the conversation from United States to across the ocean in Europe, where we have more conversation happening on values and on human-machine teaming, and where I can have an excuse to bring in our next panelist, Dr. Ansgar Koene. Dr. Ansgar has a multidisciplinary research background. He's worked and published on topics ranging from policy and governance of algorithmic systems, data privacy, AI ethics, AI standards, bio-inspired robotics, AI and computational neuroscience, to experimental human behavior / perception studies. He has an MSc in electrical engineering, a PhD in computational neuroscience, and he is a global AI ethics and regulatory leader at Ernst & Young. He's also a senior research fellow at the Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute at the University of Nottingham, like you, Husanjot, and he chairs the IEEE P7003 standard for algorithmic bias considerations working group. For those of us who did not already know this, and I learned because I do my homework for school, this is one of the standard setting committees globally. And Dr. Ansgar, very pleased to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join this panel. So as you say, there are certain differences between the kind of focus on, what are the issues that arise from having AI systems in the private sector as compared to the public sector, and specifically the military applications. But there are also strong overlaps. And actually, one thing I wanted to perhaps touch on is there was a recent study, and forgive me, I don't remember who published it, which was trying to compare the funding that was going into military AI research in the US and China, and suggested that, well, even if China is funding a lot of research in AI, it is actually funding a much smaller percentage of that into military research. But of course, comparing those numbers is very difficult, because one of the key aspects of AI is that it is a core technology that can be used in so many different application spaces. So any research that goes into doing image recognition, for instance, be it in autonomous vehicles in the civil sector, can equally be applied in the military sector and vice versa. So it is actually very difficult to try to separate funding going into private or civilian versus military applications, because AI at its core is a multi-purpose kind of technology. So as you mentioned, I'm currently working as Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at EY, also working in academia. And so what are the kinds of issues that we are seeing in the industry around AI? So a core question is this trust dimension. You mentioned, Charumati, at the beginning, the McKinsey prediction that 70% of industry is going to be heavily dominated by AI. On the other hand, what we are seeing is that a huge percentage of the industry is still very reluctant to take AI into production systems. The majority of projects around AI currently are still experimental, sandboxed kind of applications, or its use in non-critical kind of spaces, like chatbots for interacting with customers or something like that, whereas putting it really at the heart of things like predicting supply chains and those kinds of things, there's still much more reluctance because of concerns around trustworthiness. How reliable are these systems, especially if circumstances change? And we've seen that very strongly now, of course, with the whole COVID situation, where suddenly people's behaviors, purchasing behaviors, transportation behaviors, etc., have been radically different from historical patterns, which these AI systems and a lot of the scheduling systems that are based on, not on AI, but equally based on historical data, were not able to pick up on, and made radically incorrect predictions as to what supermarkets would need to be buying in, how the transportation networks should be running, and those kinds of things. So really, this question about adaptability of AI, yes, AI at its core, machine learning, etc., is adaptive. Its core advantage that it had over traditional coding of things is that it picks up patterns from data and adapts, but it does need that historical data to build on. And if you switch to a new situation that is outside of the range that this training data was in, you encounter problems. And this is really, when we're talking about algorithmic bias questions, for instance, often the first position to look at has been, what did the training data look like? Did the training data sufficiently cover the actual real world situation where the system is being applied? It didn't include enough people from minorities or from particular stakeholder groups that it was going to be applied to in the training data set. And so, how do you make the system able to adapt to changes in the environment at this kind of extent of adaptability that human actors are being able to show? And I mean, that connects to this disconnect between what AI at the moment can do and what people imagine AI to be able to do because of the anthropomorphic language that we use in this field, which is sort of the lack of understanding. These systems do not have the bigger picture understanding of what it means to be an agent operating in the world. What does the world mean, and those kinds of things. So it cannot pick up on signals and make adjustments according to that. Really what we're talking about is complicated statistics, analytic systems that can identify correlations, statistical patterns within data sets. And it can do that much better than humans can. And it has allowed us to look at much broader potential signals from much broader levels of inputs. But it is still just doing correlations. It's still just doing statistics. And so that's one of the things that is really a necessity when it comes to trustworthy use of AI, is actually also the understanding of what does this technology really do are you interpreting the results that are coming out in the right kind of way? So this is one of the things that is included in, for instance, the work that EY and others are doing in the space of, you know, how to help companies use these systems better, to make sure that you have the right communication between the different levels in the company. The management that decided to take on board an AI system, what is it that they actually wanted to achieve with it? The data scientists who built the system, what is it that they really built it for, versus the frontline people who are then using it or having to interpret the results of the system when dealing with clients. Are they interpreting it correctly? Because did they really understand what it is that the data scientists built here? And did they actually build it towards what the management really wanted to achieve? That's often where the disconnect happens, and where then we get problems with the reliability of the outcomes. So I'll hand it over and we can pick up on further discussions later on.
Certainly, and I should mention at this point that if anyone has questions for any one or all of our speakers, this would be a good time to start putting it in the chat. Dr. Ansgar, you made a very interesting point about understanding the bigger picture. One of the things we do in our classes is talk about the myths around AI. The truth around AI is that there are a lot of stakeholders involved who have very different understandings of the technology and the potential of it that's going on. In fact, not just the problems of historical data, people also talk about synthetic data, new statistical approaches, and other emerging ways to solve grand challenges that we have. And the person, or rather the entity that would be most responsible for this, is the government. So that gives me my opening to introduce our next speaker, Walter. Walter is an advisor, researcher, and speaker working at the intersection of technology, data, and public good, AI readiness, and data governance. He manages the production of the Government AI Readiness Index, which combines quantitative measures with global policy insights to measure governments' preparedness to safely implement emerging AI systems. Aside from this, he's also leading the establishment of Inside Data Trust Advisory Board, which is a consortium made up of the NHS, Google Health, and Roche, if I'm pronouncing that right, on health data sharing. He's also an AI policy fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, and a regular speaker at international tech conferences. He writes and discusses emerging technologies on his LinkedIn blog, YouTube, and IGTV. I should mention, all of our speakers are pretty active on their social media. I would definitely recommend checking out their work. He's Walter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. I will just share my screen. Okay, great. Great. Well, again, thank you so much for the introduction, for joining you here today. I would just like to say right at the beginning, one of the things I enjoy most about these webinars is that by following what's going on online, you actually get to meet the people that you sort of follow the work, and then you end up interacting with them on these webinars. And this is something that I'm looking forward to a lot throughout this session here. So I've already been introduced very quickly about the organizations that I work for. I am, on the one hand, a consultant for Oxford Insights, who is primarily concerned with how can we help governments get the most out of emerging technologies, how can we help them develop capabilities for harnessing strategic opportunities of emerging technologies and then proliferate them across different sectors. Next to this, I also work for the Open Data Institute. As the name might imply, their main task is to open up data sets, make it more available across different kinds of sectors, and hoping that, for instance, by making use of, for example, health data in a responsible manner, we can actually develop, for instance, particular kind of solutions that benefit patients. And on the other hand, I'm also working with the University of Bath as an AI policy fellow. That's more of an exploratory role. So I look at technologies that don't really exist yet and that are not really widespread across society, such as brain-computer interfaces, and kind of try to understand a bit how is it that they might impact our world in the years to come. But the topic that I'm most interested in as part of my role is really governance and AI. So I thought it was actually a very good fit for speaking about this today. And governance and AI, I think, is a really interesting topic, because it's not only it is not only about how one variable impacts the other, but also how the variable B impacts variable A. So what am I trying to say here? On the one hand, when we look at governance and artificial intelligence, there is really a question of how can we use AI for improving our systems of governance. But then on the other hand, as these kinds of capabilities improve, this can be turned around also quite well. So how can we use governance framework for then improving AI on the other hand, keeping it safe and ensuring that it is used responsibly. So at Oxford Insights, what we've been doing in the last couple of years is that we have really been trying to think about the first question, which is how can we use AI for improving our systems of governance? And we thought that the first step in understanding how we can use technologies for public good is by understanding what are our capabilities. What are the capabilities at the global level, so that we can understand where the world is heading? What are the capabilities at the regional level, so that we know what are particular initiatives? Think about the European Union, think about what is going on in Latin America. In the Middle East, there's now data institutions that share data across countries, which are really cropping up. And once we have then established these capabilities, that allows us to go in and ask more specific questions about particular countries and particular locations. Overall, we think that by building these capacities, countries can then position themselves well for getting the most out of artificial intelligence. And so there is, of course, a fundamental question here, which is, well, what is AI ready? What does it mean being AI ready? It does not mean deploying AI. It does not mean just like spreading out different kinds of technologies across society, but it means developing the raw materials that then allow us to, if I am a country that sort of wants to improve the provision of healthcare, that I can understand better what is it that my citizens need. If I am, say, a country that wants to invest into agriculture, I can understand, well, what are areas of my country that might need particular kinds of attention. So it really provides an overview for understanding where is it that, that I can have the most impact through technology. So what we've been trying to do here is really build a fairly general framework to start with for understanding, well, how ready am I as a country? And the first one is really like developing something like in the government pillar, which is like developing a vision. National AI strategies are becoming more and more popular. Pretty much every country is developing one at the moment. But also other questions such as, well, what are my values? It's not only about how strong do I want my technology to be, but also in what particular way do I want to implement it, and how do I try to mitigate maybe some consequences that I might not have taken into account immediately. There is also another question as to the data and infrastructure, and that's a particular interesting one, I think, because infrastructure, having the right technological infrastructure in place, is a prerequisite for having a successful deployment of emerging technologies. Without it, it's a bit like having a nail without a hammer, so it won't really get us far. That's also why questions such as 5G at the moment are so highly politicized. And then on the other hand, there is also the technology sector itself. Most innovation is done by tech companies, less so by government. Governments are stepping up now. There is emergences of ecosystems such as the GovTech ecosystem, where sort of there is exchanges between like governments and companies. But overall, I think across the board, we do think that the countries that have strong technology sectors are also the ones that will have the best implementation of AI within government. And so this framework here is something that has allowed us to then go deeper and say, look at the regional levels, and zoom in closer and ask more specific questions. For example, what are regional patterns? Who are the leading players in particular regions? what countries are taking different strategies, why, what sectors are particularly important. In Latin America, in a large part of Asia, agriculture is incredibly important. In other regions of the world, it might be health or finance. It's not the same for across the world. And so having this level of granularity and asking the right questions is especially important for making sure that governments can get the most value out of these technologies. And then also a topic which is really has been emerging recently is, well, what could be strong regional initiatives? Across some regions which have, for instance, similarities in language, we see now that there are like data institutions evolving and like cross-country data sharing agreements that allow countries for getting like exchanging data, allowing them to basically get most value by not only working for themselves, but also by working with other countries. And then probably the part that I find most interesting is working with countries themselves. So once we have established this framework, we usually use it as a broad scaffolding for asking the more deeper questions. So this is, for example, an example of India. This may lets us sort of visualize, well, how strong is India in vision and in the kinds of strategy that they have. And India is very strong in vision, in part because they have a good national strategy. But then we can look at, for instance, what are the sort of like the pillars where there's still room for improvement. And then, of course, if we look at data and infrastructure, the data is very clear here, and that can make us ask additional questions. Why is that the case? What is it that sort of we can do for improving this particular kinds of capability? In the case of India, for example, we have a case where there is actually a lot of data being produced, but we need the better governance mechanisms for making this data more available to the right kinds of stakeholders. And so this is really one way of sort of how AI can be basically used for improving systems of governance. But when you're on the ground, when you're in the countries, there is then also a question of how can we use system of governments to improve AI? And so there is a couple of sort of policy enablers, I think that can be implemented for making sure that government actually supports the development of AI ecosystem. On the one hand, there's the AI strategies, national ethics framework became kind of fashionable almost a couple of years ago. Now it's really more about shifting from ethics to responsibility and asking sort of questions such as, what kind of values do I have as a country? And then finally, there's data institutions. And data institutions, I think, is really where we can see the next years, a lot of traction happening, in the sense that there seems to be a problem across the board that is basically, there is lots of data available, but it's held in silos. There is a lack of trust of who uses it, and there's a fear of unintended consequences. So there is really a desire to increasing access to data whilst maintaining trust. And these kinds of data institutions are becoming a solution that can help us get there. For example, take the case of agriculture. Agriculture is in general a sector where there's very little trust. Farmers are always worried that the data is going to be used against them, that subsidies will be cut. So what can we do? We can build a data institution that can collect this data, but makes it available only to certain stakeholders for particular kinds of purposes. It sounds easier than it actually is. Whilst when we're on the ground, then things become much more complicated. But I really do believe that for several sectors where there is data needed for creating groundbreaking innovations, but there is also sensitivities attached, this is really, I think, the future of how innovation will be created and how government can support the development of AI. What can we expect in the next few years on the government side? I think national strategies and ethics framework, they will basically develop across the board. There's going to be more regional initiatives in the European Union now. The European Commission is doing a lot of work. They have their high-level expert group. They have now a new white paper, but also in Latin America, in South and Central Asia, in North America, there is going to be more and more initiatives. And then finally, I think that data institutions will become for specific sectors, a new way of how sort of governments will support the development of new technologies. Thank you very much. I have here some details if people want to get in touch after that. I'll just share them in the chat, but I look forward to receiving your questions.
Wonderful. We definitely picked up on some very important challenges and ways to think about them. And I love the emphasis on asking the right question. And that is going to be our next step. We move on to the questions that our participants have raised in this time. I will have the burden of summarizing some of these, but fortunately, the very first question is open-ended. So it's addressed to all of you. The question is regarding the US elections and how algorithmic bias and the shaping of perceptions would have affected them. Considering that there are serious allegations against Russia and China, what is the American response on combating this? Husanjot, perhaps you could start on this one?
Yeah, so I think I'll answer this question by first kind of laying out a caveat that from the open source, it's really hard to kind of lay out all of the efforts that are really happening out there. But a lot of the efforts in countering such operations by Russian or Chinese security forces for that matter, in some sense can be, or by even non-state actors actually, can be seen under the cyber operations side of things in terms of the research that we conducted, and specifically how what are the investments or the efforts that are really being done or undertaken to defend critical US infrastructure from cyber attacks. And cyber was not really a part of our study, but I believe for anyone who's interested in learning more about this, there's a lot of information available out there, and a lot my house of information in these budget justification books, which can give a better insight into that.
Dr. Ansgar, any thoughts on the shaping of perceptions in the elections?
Sure. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions, especially since 2016, with both the US election and Brexit having a lot of concerns about misinformation, disinformation campaigns, potentially having had an impact on the outcome of the referendum and the election in that year. And one of the sort of main responses that I think we've seen has been around pushing the platforms to do more content moderation, to do more attempts to identify whether something is especially a deliberate attempt at misinforming people, so disinformation, and then to either remove it. There's been a lot of hesitancy to do actual removal because that impacts on freedom of speech, but then instead to label it as this as potentially contentious content. However, as you will all be very aware of, there's been a lot of criticism to the extent to which platforms have truly engaged with this, to the extent that they have been inconsistent in the way in which they've actually implemented their own policies around that. I think at the national kind of level, there's been a lot of thinking around how should we be dealing with online platforms and especially social media when it comes to this kind of content. The driving sort of underlying principle of a lot of these platforms that allowed them to grow was the platform neutrality, that the platform has no responsibility for the content that it did not create but is merely hosting, and that this is being largely reconsidered, especially in the context of the role that the algorithms behind the platforms that push certain content to become more visible or less visible are actually having a type of editorial role, editorially in the sense of deciding what goes on the front page and what gets buried in the last page of the newspaper, sort of to give a traditional analogy. So there's been a lot of work in that space, I think, and certainly in the election, US election this year as compared to 2016, there's been a lot more of this fact-checking, labeling of content. Has this been significant in, had a significant effect on how people have engaged with that content? I'm not aware of conclusive studies in that space at this time, but perhaps one or the other of our speakers might have something more to say on that.
Walter, perhaps you would have something?
Yeah, thank you very much. I first of all, I agree with everything that my fellow panelists have said as well. I do think that in the United States, the debate around the topic of neutrality of platforms, specifically Section 230. So that is basically that platforms like Twitter or Facebook cannot be sued for content posted on their platforms by their users. I agree with Ansgar. This is probably really the space where we can see a lot of traction. My worry is that in the next few years, this is going to be heavily politicized. Because if you look at the campaign, Biden said, yes, let's remove Section 230. Trump said also, let's remove Section 230, but for two very different reasons. Because on the one hand, Biden sort of wants to remove these protections, and on the other hand, push sort of social media platforms against doing something. But Trump, and in particularly the Republicans, want to remove these protections because they have sort of they have a bit of an obsession that these social media platforms are censoring conservative voices, and by removing these protections, they can basically make them fall into line. I am not sure exactly how it will play out in the future. I do think that Section 230 is going to get a redesign at least. But aside from that, there is also a more technological issue in itself, I believe. And that is that the fake news that we have right now, basically like some bot that can distribute and spread information that upsets people and then creates like some kind of emotional responses and polarizes people or just spreads misinformation. I think we still haven't, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because right now with the development of deepfakes, soon we will not be able to discern anymore what is a footage of someone who is saying something. Is it actually something that is it real footage or not? So these deepfakes are basically technologies that can fake. They can basically replicate someone's face, and so they can basically create a video where it looks that, I don't know, President Obama says horrible things. And the danger is now we can still spot it, but in a few years' time, there is a problem that even like news sites that we consider to be trustworthy might be sharing content because it just looks accurate. And so it really, some people call it the erosion of truth on social media. And there is technological solutions that we can develop for contrasting this. But on the other hand, the same technological solutions that we can have for detecting fake content and misinformation that can be deployed during elections are the same kinds of technologies that actually creates these deepfakes. And so it's very complex how we want to solve this. Potential solutions are that, and I'm not sure if this is working, but some social media platforms are, for instance, proposing that we have like an initial filter that can basically detect what is real and what is not real. I don't know in situations with high stakes such as elections how this is going to play out, but certainly this will create a lot of room for more debate and policy initiatives.
Most definitely, and we do have some interesting questions on big tech companies coming up later in the chat. For now, however, we're going to stick with Husanjot, it seems. The next two questions, I'm going to combine them because the questions relate to what drives US investment in AI at the moment. How much is motivated by the global arms race against China? And are they the ones setting the goalposts on how much funding goes into AI?
Yeah, Just to add to what Walter and Ansgar just highlighted about like countering deepfake and misinformation, like I agree there's a lot of research on that's already like going on countering deepfakes and identifying like which ones are real images and which ones are not. I recall there's a program that DARPA is currently working on. I think it's called media forensics, and I mean there's a lot of information available out there like on this, but basically it like kind of attempts to level the digital imagery playing field, and like which kind of like currently favors the manipulator by developing technologies for automated assessments of like the integrity of an image or a video, and kind of integrating these into end-to-end like media forensic platforms. And and coming back to the question that you asked me, I'd say that in terms of the goalposts, like I wouldn't say there are any goalposts as of now, but I believe that I think your question hints more to how is success defined in this arena of like AI and autonomy research and the amount of investments that are going in it. I think like that can be really seen from like as you know, like a majority of the research work that is happening on AI and autonomy in the US military is really still at the research and development phase. And we haven't, there's not enough that has really reached the testing, evaluation, validation, verification stage. So not really like, there's not much that's been fielded. So I guess in some sense, success here would be defined by like how much like the research efforts that have moved from R&D to TE and V&B stage. So that is one way to look at it. But like, I wouldn't say that there would be specific numbers in some sense, which like would define like as like a threshold which the US military should be reaching in order to kind of have like enough of AI and autonomy research. Moving on to the second question about the global arms race, I'd say that while it is really important to not ignore the strategic context in which US and China are operating, and therefore I'm sure that there's some decisions makers out there in the US military who might be concerned about the security threats that are posed by China, and which is posed as an adversary. But at the same time, it would be wrong to say that that all of it really comes as a result of this fear. Most of this, the US research efforts, for example, I would say like have even in the arena of AI and autonomy, not in the current like sophistication, or not in the version that we look at it today, but like most of these research efforts on AI and autonomy really like date back to decades ago actually. So when the scenario was very different, and maybe these efforts were big or small, and I mean, yeah, so the global geopolitical scenario was different back then, and it really like varied across and like the strategic context was different. The adversary in some sense, traditional adversary seen by the US was different. So yeah, in that sense, we can say that like a lot of the US research efforts are there could be some national security leaders who do see like it imperative to kind of invest in more R&D for AI and autonomy because of the threat posed by China, but it essentially is not only driven by that. Like there is, yeah, that's all I want to say.
We continue our conversation on China with the next question for Walter. China recently came out with a global initiative on data security and associated policies. What do we need to do to make sure the global governance of data is not hijacked by authoritarian regimes?
Sorry, would you mind repeating your question?
Let that sink in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the question is on China's new global initiative on data security. Given Chinese domestic laws on intelligence, which require companies to share data for intelligence, what steps does the world need to take to ensure that global governance of data is not hijacked by authoritarian regimes?
This is a really interesting question. I think there are primarily two kinds of like 2 points here that I want to emphasize. The first one is that overall data, with the exception of data which is, say, for tells us about national security, or data that tells us about or like personal data, so data that is highly sensitive, I believe that under the right circumstances, it should be out in the open. If we have data out in the open and made accessible through the right kinds of mechanisms and through the right kinds of vehicles, I think that everyone benefits from it. Research institutions, industry, even the data holders and data providers themselves, because that way other companies or other stakeholders can create value that can be returned to them in one way or another. If we're looking now at countries with authoritarian forms of government that want to get access to particular kinds of data sets that might tell them what are sort of my security initiatives, or what are kind of like the security policies that a country in the West might have, or a country that is perceived as a competitor has. I think this is an area where governments have to develop the right kinds of security capabilities. It ultimately, I think, is a very different kinds of area from, say, data that is more like part of society, that data that is more part of industry. But I really would make a strong differentiation here between data that is part of government's essential interests and government's like security proposals and government's policies, and the other kinds of data from industry and from people. They require two very different kinds of protection mechanisms. We see it already now. There is much more conflict than we actually are perceiving already happening, in terms of like governments going into other governments' affairs and trying to understand what is it that they're actually doing by doing data breaches. The thing is just that it is a new form of conflict that is not directly perceived by us, and for that reason, I think that I don't necessarily see a direct threat from, say, governments obtaining personal data or industry data about citizens. I think the threat is much more if it's not made out in the open, but if it's like basically concentrated in the hands of a few. Because if data is concentrated in the hands of a few, then there is much more influence that can be taken as on the individual citizens and people.
If I might just add to this, I think if we're thinking about the way in which national security is being used as an excuse to access potential data, or concerns around foreign countries accessing data of citizens from our country, let's say. This is, yes, it is a concern when it comes to China and authoritarian regimes, but it is equally a concern between the so-called Western allies or whatever. Let's not forget that the Schrems II ruling that has become such a problem for data flows between Europe and the US is based on the fact that US legislation also allows the US national security agencies to access data of non-US citizens that is being held in the US. So they have fairly similar powers when it comes to accessing data as the Chinese government does. And this is causing problems for data exchanges between Europe and the US traditional allies. So these are not just concerns between the authoritarian regimes and other regimes. It's basically, as Walter hinted, every country is interested in trying to get extra information about what other countries are doing to give them an edge in negotiations of one type or another, or to get access to data. The other dimension being, of course, the cybersecurity side, which Walter also already piloted at. And in that space, I think it's interesting to reflect on a recent report that suggested that North Korea gets about 15% of its GDP through through Bitcoin hacks and other types of cyber operations. So this is definitely a space that needs better international governance. However, how to get there is always tricky when every country considers that it might potentially have an advantage by not having strong oversight regimes in place.
Well, that was an excellent point worth making, which is why I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the question list and ask Dr. Ansgar the question that's come on oversight regimes. Given that governments have a lot of responsibility for developing our ethics systems, but the data is handled by global big tech firms, the question is, how can private players be made to follow ethical standards around data security? And who can be responsible for the oversight of this compliance by private companies?
Sure. This is definitely a big area of concern, and especially when it comes also to the balance of power in the digital realm between the global north and the global south, for instance. The sense that a lot of the service provision is being done by big tech companies from the north that are effectively exfiltrating, pulling out data from the global south. I think one important aspect to just realize is, of course, governments hold immense power when it comes to passing legislation, and companies have to be compliant with that legislation. Without being compliant, they will not be able to do business in your space. When it comes to that, I think GDPR is a very interesting case in point. This was the most heavily lobbied piece of legislation in EU history, with the amount of money being pushed in by industry to try and reduce the strength of the GDPR legislation. It was pushed through nevertheless. Various industries made noises that they said, well, in that case, we're going to pull out of the European market or something like that. The European market is much too valuable to do that. So if, most recently, we heard Facebook saying that if the Irish Data Protection Authority were to seriously enforce its rules, that they would pull out of the European market. They're not going to do that. This is much too lucrative a market, and the relative price that they would have to pay in becoming compliant relative to the market share that they would lose by pulling out, it just doesn't make economic sense. So there has been, in a sense, a lot of governments have allowed themselves to be lulled into a sense of, we need to do what the companies are saying because they know how this space operates, and we are not tech savvy and we don't really know this. We've seen that, for instance, in the way in which the NHS has handed over data to tech companies without seriously making an effort to get a strong monetization or otherwise return for the value of the data that they've been handing over. And I think there is a growing realization about the fact that actually governments can take a stand in this and can impose regulation. Of course, there's always if you're going to be the most heavily regulating kind of space as opposed to somewhere else, is that going to induce a flight of capital, a flight of a brain drain into that other domain where the innovation will happen. So we have that competition, and we also see that in things like the narrative of China's investing this much in AI, therefore US, EU must invest at least that much. It's partially also just used as a way of enticing governments to invest more into the industry. I'm not saying that this is not necessary, the investments, but it is definitely part of the way in which the game is being played, is that you're pointing to the other one saying, we mustn't fall behind that one, so please do what I want for us in our space. But the difficulty with doing regulation for AI is really that it's okay to talk about AI as a unitary kind of thing when we're talking about high-level principles. But when we start to get into the actual regulating, for instance, what we've seen in the European Commission's AI white paper on identifying what is high risk versus not high risk applications of AI, then you need to start looking at not AI as a vague big thing, but at the specifics of the application. And really, you need to start looking at regulating AI, this particular type of application in this particular sector. So automated decision making in the transport sector versus in the education sector versus in the medical sector, and you can't even talk about automated decision making as a whole. You'll have to talk about specific types of application, which is why, in the end, my expectation is that, to the largest extent, the regulation will fall into the traditional kind of sectoral regulators. They will need upskilling to understand what the impact of AI is on their particular sector. To a certain extent, the financial sector is leading in that space because of the whole 2008 financial problems with failure to understand the models that were being used at that time. But as we're pushing from high-level discussions towards real regulation, it will become more granular and it will move towards sectoral specific kind of regulatory aspects, with the occasional slightly more broader one, like discussions about liability regimes and those kinds of things. And this is a complicated discussion. So despite noises from the European Commission that they will come out with legislation very, very soon, it's likely to still take a little while.
No, you're right. The EU has been making plans on a number of pieces of legislation, which are all interconnected and all very important. Well, what we're going to do now is, given the questions that we have, I will put one question to each panelist from the remaining ones, and then we will move on to the closing statements. First, Husanjot, there is a question on counterterrorism. The question asks that AI-driven tools are playing a key role in cybersecurity and aspects of deterrence. And to what extent will counterterrorism forces rely on AI? Some examples, I think, would be helpful.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'll just give the other questions as well, that you all have some time to formulate your closing statements as well. Walter, the question here is, again, we're back to the big tech firms. The question is that there are allegations against multinational software giants threatening governments and small states who are already using their products for corporate espionage or to serve national interests. And AI could potentially increase the intensity and complexity of these issues. What would be your views? Dr. Ansgar, the final question that we have for you is, how does artificial intelligence implicate human resources? I realize this is a very broad question, and I leave it to you to take it in whichever direction would be suitable. Husan, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Aru. To answer this question about like the use of AI and autonomous platforms for counterterrorism operations, I'll just like begin by like kind of saying that in our paper we looked at like AI and autonomous applications as sort of functional categories, specifically like unmanned systems, information processing, like decision support and targeting functions. So in that sense, you can say that we can use like these technologies for specific military operations in diverse settings, including like for counterterrorism. But like if I have to point out, like there are some examples of like research programs that we looked at that would be like particularly sort of in some sense like helpful in envisioning and utilizing that in a counterterrorism setting. One is the US Air Force's Skyborg program, which is basically like you kind of partner an unmanned aerial vehicle with like fighter jets in order to kind of like utilize utilize it for like intelligence collection missions that are too dangerous for like a manned aircraft to go. So this is mostly in dangerous regions, like where or it could be used as let's say for the US counterterrorism forces to kind of conduct information collection in areas which are otherwise very dangerous for pilots to go in. The other example that I can give is of DARPA's Squad X program, which kind of partners in infantry squads with AI and autonomous systems, which is like you have an autonomous ground vehicle that goes along with the forces as they venture out. So in some senses, like a manned-unmanned teaming to enhance capabilities for ground units, giving the squad like insights and intelligence way ahead by moving into dangerous territories before the soldiers. So it really helps in surveillance and improving situational awareness for counterterrorism forces that are moving through dangerous hotspots. So these are the two examples that I can point out to. I think like in just to kind of like close my presentation today, I'll just as I mentioned, one of the findings was the significance of the emphasis on human-machine teaming through all of like the research programs that we looked at, and in some sense like the lack of like research efforts on trust. So on that front, like I just like to bring out this question of kind of this interconnectedness of these various approaches, like reliability, explainability, transparency, and all of these, and how they really like interplay and like fall under the umbrella of trust in that sense. So there's an interesting study that looks at the interaction between explainability and reliability, and this is like a helpful example maybe to kind of envision it. So the findings showed that people tend to trust technologies more when the technology is able to explain itself. But like this explanation really doesn't have much of an effect if the system is reliable. So in that sense, it really tells us that all of these variables, explainability, reliability, transparency, they don't really exist in isolation, and the interactions between them are like critical to study because they interact with themselves, and that interaction kind of affects the way in which humans trust technologies. So in that sense, like yeah, like I would just like to re-emphasize the significance of like studying like trustworthiness in AI and autonomy, and yeah, like to just reiterate the point that we need to have a lot more research both in the military as well as in the private sector as well, like in kind of like on trust in AI and autonomy, and just so that we can have like most safer technologies in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. Walter, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much. Yes, so the question is that there are allegations against multinational software giants that they are threatening governments and small states who are already using products for corporate espionage or to serve national interests. And what kinds of what kind of power dynamics does this create? What kind of dependencies does this create? With AI, the assumption here is in this question that it might increase actually this this issue. Now, let's break it down. First of all, what do I think are the issues there? I do think that there is right now at the governmental level a very high degree of dependency, and dependency of governments to needing to use the technological solutions and technological services provided by particular kinds of tech firms. That in itself is not a problem as long as there is a variety of choices from whom basically these kinds of technological solutions are basically purchased or rented or you name it. But it becomes more an issue when these services are basically concentrated among just a few couple of stakeholders, because in that case, if you have your entire government operating system running on Drive or running on other kinds of platforms, then you create a kind of dependency from which it is very difficult to sort of move away. I know that there are some foreign offices which have basically their entire documents and entire platforms running on Drive, which is interesting to say the least, because that creates particular kinds of dependencies, but also security issues that companies can go in. And whilst they would in practice never do that, I think the authority for being able to do this is in the gray area at least. There is also another question which I think fits very well into sort of the comment that has been made here, is that also, as Ansgar already sort of like implied, is that the lobbying efforts by these kinds of tech giants are incredible. So there is vast amounts of money spent from the big tech companies on influencing legislation. There is sort of the open door policy where they sort of actually try to recruit people from government and sending people from their tech firms then into government. And that creates as well different kinds of pressures that can basically, I don't want to use the word threaten because I think that's a bit harsh, but what can basically influence legislative processes and governments. There has been another case, I think, at the EU level where one company, without mentioning names, sort of information was leaked that they were actually trying to sort of start a campaign against particular kinds of commissioner to basically write op-eds for journals and trying to discredit initiatives and trying to basically undermine the credibility of the political system. So yes, there is a big problem of dependency, and there is a big problem that governments might have basically might feel threatened by tech firms. The issue there is, I think, to reduce this dependency, we can try to stimulate an ecosystem where smaller companies, or at least a more diverse set of companies, can provide these kinds of solutions to government. That, I think, is the most straightforward answer. It's also the answer that basically provides a less disruptive policies, such as like, you know, there is all these talks about now breaking these big companies up. That's something that, even though the US has started doing initiatives on that, and the EU has started initiatives too, antitrust processes, they don't take a year or two, they take 10 to 15 years on average. That's something that takes a long time, and it's even uncertain whether that's actually going to happen. So right now, to find solution to this issue, there are this new ecosystems as emerging. People call it GovTech, which is basically like trying to create like initiatives that help governments sell to tech startups, and tech startups sell to government. And that in turn is seen as something that could maybe break up some of the dependencies and some of the monopoly of big tech firms, which in turn would then reduce the issue that there is a threat that tech giants and software companies might actually have some more sway and power over governments. I do think that the way to get there is, of course, that there is regulation in place. So again, I'm not sure that the whole antitrust process will eventually play out the way we imagine it, but I do think that the European Union, through their strategy, as they have demonstrated with GDPR, there will definitely be decisive action taken against companies. That is not only the case in Europe, but that's also the case in other regions of the world, where governments are increasingly being worried that, especially with tech companies going into fields of countries with which they might be in either competition or friction, that there might be some kinds of issues arising there. And to conclude, there is also, I think, a trend right now that some blocks of countries actually want to establish the response, basically the diverse set of the purchasing of tech solutions from different kinds of smaller companies as their competitive advantage to attract large-scale investments. That is the case for Estonia. That is the case for countries like Singapore. These are all countries that are taking initiatives to decrease the dependency of big tech on big tech firms, and thereby reduce the threat that they might feel large companies might have on them.
Certainly, it is a difficult question to answer. We can now move to the final question of the day. Dr. Ansgar, if you please.
Sure. So if I remember correctly, the question was quite broadly framed as to what about the impact of AI on human resources? And there are so many different ways in which this impact can happen that I would almost suggest let's have another session, another panel on this. One thing to point to is it is actually difficult to get good view on how much AI is being used in companies really as part of human resources. So there's different dimensions in which this is happening. One that has attracted a lot of immediate attention has been as part of the recruitment process, how applicants are being pre-screened before they ever get to see a human in the recruitment trajectory, and potential bias in the way in which the algorithms are operating when they do that pre-screening. But there's also a lot of happening and a lot of concern around the use of monitoring of employees actually as they are using their company issued laptop in this COVID work from home environment, or traditionally working in the office on the infrastructure there. They can legally, in many countries, they can legally be tracked, as to which websites are they visiting, which app are they using on their thing, how much are they typing, how quickly are they typing, and potentially even with built-in webcams, etc., monitoring whether or not the person is looking at the screen and those kinds of things. So there's a potential for very invasive kinds of monitoring. The largest counteractor to this is that if companies engage in these kinds of practices, it is obviously a very strong sign that the company does not trust its employees, and that tends to be reciprocated by a lack of trust by the employees in the company. And so if people have the option of moving to a different place of employment, they may very well do that. However, the use of AI in human resources was one of the questions that we had received by the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation 2 years ago, when they asked us to do a landscape review of the use of AI in the UK. And we found it was very difficult to get information about this. You can easily see what companies that are producing this kind of software are offering to the market. But most companies will not tell you we are using this kind of algorithm. They will just say, submit to us your CV, and then somehow you get a response and you don't know whether an algorithm was used for doing the pre-screening or not. For some reason, my video just stopped showing. Okay. So it's a very complicated space. One of the first things, perhaps just as a final remark to make on this, we are actually seeing some jurisdictions starting to move into this space, specifically the use of data-driven methods to do assessment of during the recruitment process. The City of New York has put forward a proposal for legislation in this that would require all such types of algorithms to go through a bias audit, that they need to show that the system is not biased against different protected categories. And unless they can show that they've done this audit and passed this audit, they will not be allowed to use this technology in the City of New York. So this is just an initial sign of this is also on the radar with legislators, and there's probably a lot going to happen in this space in the near future.
Do we have Charu here, or
she's there? I think she was frozen.
Okay, yeah. Charu, are you there? Okay, I think she's frozen. I'm not sure.
Definitely. The near future is certain to be a very, very...
Sorry,
I'm
Charu.
not sure I could hear Dr. Ansgar towards the end. Have I cut him off?
No. I think you were fine. It's just your network dropped for like a second, so you can start over again, please.
I think yes, there is still problem with the network.
Oh gosh. Okay.
Yeah, that's a Palvi, I think you should go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry. We can't have a moderator back, I think. But Charu, I'd like to first of all thank you. I know that you were going to conclude anyway, so thank you to Charumati for joining us as the moderator and keeping the discussion very lively because such different questions, such varied questions, and getting that and actually just mixing it all together. I think that's a great job. But thank you definitely to Ansgar, Husanjot, and Walter for joining us today because I know you're joining from different time zones, different work commitments, and thank you so much for joining. To all the participants for the questions, I really love the eclectic mix of questions we've had today. And it's been the trend always that we have that kind of a mix of questions. So thank you for participating always. And we'll see you, a lot of you, on Saturday, hopefully, on the session on Black Sea and Caspian Sea and the geopolitical developments in that region. So, and have a good evening, everyone, or a good morning to Husanjot, afternoon to the ones in Europe. So, have a good time, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you, Palvi.
everyone. Thank you so much.